Hello, welcome to the video on a close reading of Letter from Birmingham Jail by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm Dr. Stacy Graham with the Teaching with Primary Sources at Middle Tennessee State University program. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. So now you're looking at a 3-page worksheet that we created that looks at 2 different excerpts of this very famous letter. And this is geared towards 5th grade students. So it's taking a complex text and making it so that 5th graders can understand what it says, why it says it, and why it's significant. So this first page here gives you a bit of background with some links that are helpful for establishing what's going on at this time, what is he writing this letter in response to, who's the audience, etc. And so basically, this, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to sum it up real fast right here. The background to this letter is, so King goes to Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. Birmingham is a city in the South that is incredibly segregated, and it's known for that, even in, among other Southern cities. And so there's a real need there for some leadership and some organized protests to try to bring down and dismantle that system. So King and other leaders are leading protests, and a group of 8 different clergymen, which include Christian and Jewish religious leaders in Birmingham, they're all, they write a letter and they publish it in the newspaper. And the letter is geared towards King, but by publishing the newsletter, of course, everybody can read it. And so what they say, basically, in a nutshell, to King is, okay, we understand what you're saying. Yes, we would like these things to happen as well. We would like for, the situation to get better, just like you do. But I don't think we agree with the way that you're going about doing this. You need to kind of hold your horses there. This is not well timed. And so King shoots a letter back to them. And he's in Birmingham jail for his role in the protest. And so from jail, he writes this very long letter. It's directed towards the clergyman, but of course it's published in the papers so that everyone can also read that. So that's kind of the immediate setting for this letter. And we link to the full text of the letter through here. But if you were to actually print out the whole thing, it would be like 6 pages of very tiny print. It would take almost an hour to read through the whole thing out loud. So it was very hard to break it down to 2 different excerpts that we thought were the best, but we did. So we're going to actually go through the very first excerpt here. An unjust law is no law at all. But before we do that, I also want to show that a couple of the links that we include here as additional resources. So these 2 bullet points will take you to different video clips that the Library of Congress has made available as part of one of their online exhibitions, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which of course is a very important piece of legislation that comes out 1 year after all this stuff going down in Birmingham that we're talking about. So the first clip is actually an interview that King did in 1957 with NBC News, where he's talking about his philosophy of nonviolent protest and why it's a good, positive thing. And the second clip that we link to is from May 1963. So it's right after what takes place in the letter from Birmingham jail. And this is from CBS News, and it actually has footage, like news footage, of the cops unleashing the dogs and turning the fire hoses onto the peaceful protesters. And then towards the end, they have this very brief interview with King where he's talking about why he was in Birmingham and what he hopes to accomplish there. So both of those are very short, and they would be really good to help you kind of get into the setting so you understand this letter better. Okay, so I'm just this over here on the left-hand side, of course, is the excerpt from the actual text. Then you follow the arrows to these different notes here that ask questions, do paraphrases, and give you a little bit of background that you may not be able to know just from reading the text that help it make sense. So let's do it. My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined, legal, and nonviolent pressure. So some of these gains that they have actually achieved by 1963, according to this note, are, well, the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case from 1954 that officially desegregates public schools. Also, successes like the Montgomery bus boycott, where Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. The sit-in protests, where young Black men and women across the South refused to give up their seats at the lunch counters, thus desegregating downtown businesses in a lot of cities, and freedom rides. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. So in his use of the phrase well-timed, King is directly addressing one of the main criticisms of the clergymen for whom the letter was written, because they said that these protests in Birmingham were untimely, basically kicking the can down the road, not wanting to deal with it at that moment. And what he says to that is, for years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. So the note just says that Negro was actually at this time a common word to refer to Black people, kind of like the way that we say African American now. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. So that's actually a reference to the very first recorded sale of slaves in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, which would have been 344 years before this letter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your Black brothers and sisters, when you have seen the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society. So the note here says that King was very concerned with poverty, and he sought for economic justice for African Americans as well as social and legal justice. So this was the main reasons, one of the main reasons for the famous March on Washington that'll happen later this year, where he gives his I Have a Dream speech. The name of the march was actually March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So that shows you that he has this economic concern very, very high here. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. So here we hear a lot of language that sounds very biblical, which makes a lot of sense because King himself is a minister and he's speaking right now directly to other ministers. So they would have been familiar with this kind of language. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, so opposite to that, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with Saint Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. So who was Saint Augustine? Well, he was a Christian bishop in Northern Africa in the early 5th century, so over 1,500 years ago. But he was also one of the most important theologians of the Christian church in the West. So again, here you have King speaking as a minister to other ministers, telling them, hey, you would agree with Saint Augustine, wouldn't you? And to which they can't say no. So it's very smart for him to be using this religious language in his argument. Well, that's the first excerpt. The second one deals with the white moderate, and it has a tiny little vocabulary bank to help you. And then at the end, we have some questions for thought. So this is something you can discuss among your classmates, with your teachers, or you can just think about yourself. So if the law is not morally right, then how do you decide what's right? So if an unjust law is no law at all, how do you decide what's unjust? So these are really hard questions that grown-ups are grappling with all the time. But this is exactly the kind of thing that King is pointing to in this letter. So that will bring us to a close. I want you to take this and read it on your own, go through the second excerpt, and please join us for when we post our next video in the Close Reading series. Thank you so much. Bye.